To this date, I am still looking up at my TV and not down here, which shouldn't be too much of a problem because I'm obviously going to be reading anyway, so let's not worry about that. So, we're on chapter 2. One moment. Insert me drop cap there. They just keep disappearing, these things. Drop cap. Dropped. Simple as that. And then without further ado, he says click and save. Right. Good squandered 33 seconds there, so let's try to catch up. Vinaya examined the perfectly square patch of grass upon which she was stood. She was encased by 4 walls of layered slate that formed the old ruin. What had become of the roof and floor she did not know, and yet a small alcove remained. Strung along by an intense curiosity she had never managed to quell in her new life, she neared it and lowered herself to all fours to poke her head in. She gazed up to find a thin chimney with a rounded frame of cloudy sky gazing back down at her. A splash of rain caught her eye, forcing her to recoil carefully, mindful that she did not bump her head on the alcove's arch. She then rose to her feet and patting the dirt and the few stray blades of foliage from her knees before turning back to the short doorway. She lowered her head and passed through, then glanced about elsewhere. It was the last of the 3 small derelict ruins she had inspected. The rain was light and seemed unlikely to soak them any time soon. The glorious sunshine of that melancholic morning had now disappeared under the many clouds, and so high up on the hollow pike as they were, the second tallest of the 3 Sparrow Tops mountains, what was possibly a light wind far below was occasionally brutal to her. Suffice to say, she had been staggered by it infrequently, but it did little to hamper her appetite to explore. She hadn't seen much in the way of mountains before, and there, whichever way she gazed, there was always a larger mountain in the distance, linked by steep, sloping spines of landmass. Small tunnels dotted these mountains that housed, in some cases, short-lived mines and the scars of prospectors. She wandered towards the gaping mouth of one such tunnel entrance, its open maw staring at her, daring her to enter the infinite black. Struggling with hay fever at the moment, by the way, so I apologise profusely for the sniffling and everything. Tried to keep it to a minimum, but I really can't help it. I do apologise. How unfortunate of the Druidic people of Avaria that Alumnic had. How unfortunate of the Druidic people of Avaria that the Alumnic had come in. The raiders' tempers were wrought with violence and their hearts mired in lust for precious minerals that were later said didn't exist in the first place. Further still, Eris had once advised Vinaya of more recent rumours that suggested the gems were a rumour that stemmed from the Kefik Dominion. Although not proven, it would have made for a wise, if not sinister, move to deflect the relentless raids from the Dominion's borders with Ulumnor and turn the Alumnic ire towards the peaceful Avarians. The Druids were not versed in combat at the time, but rumours aside, the truth was currently dire. The peaceful Druids had found themselves being raided and pillaged, kidnapped and enslaved, raped and maimed. Ulumnor itself was an unstable region of townships where alliances were announced and ripped up daily. Those gems, however, did a fine job of uniting those townships to focus their violence on the hapless Avarians rather than one another and the Kefik Dominion. It was the Gaelok Peninsula, the bulk of western Avaria, that had suffered the brunt of these raids. Given the scale of those incursions, it was entirely reasonable to declare the raids nothing short of an invasion, and it was one the Druids were not prepared for. There were calls for aid to eastern Avaria, where a younger Ekharne made a bid to gather a vast host of Druids, but little help came from their eastern cousins. Little help came even when one particular band of Alumnic raiders scoured as far as the central Avarian locality of the Sparrow Tops in their brutal search for the rumoured gems. Those very tunnels and ruins were a legacy of those raiders and their efforts to find the rubies, the sapphires, or the emeralds. The minerals in discussion changed frequently. More likely than not, the mines were tunneled out on the backs of Druidic slaves. What a tragic thought, she concluded with a visible wince of regret. But she was aware the stories did not end there. She had been told by her lover that it was the same Elder Ekharne who would personally petition the easterly and westerly king of the Kefik dominion to intercede following the lax response from the eastern Druids. Despite his own heroics in battle, the situation was fast slipping from his grasp. Ekharne was not disappointed. A pact was swiftly made, and ships bearing the banners of the Kefik dominions, Westrond and Estakith armies soon crossed the green-blue sea, led by one young Radalin Alarxi, advised by the renowned arcanist Harifan Relafane, and landed on the north shores of Gaelok. Battles ensued, bloody ones, and they did not last long. The Alumnic raiders were not prepared to face any amount of disciplined fighting force and were soundly defeated time and time again. But Tavaria's next problem soon became apparent. Not only did the armies of the Kefik Dominion not leave when their work was done, but they also established colonies throughout the Gaelok Peninsula, in some cases within the confines of existing Druidic settlements, such as Lursk, that had been commandeered for the battles with Ulumnor and were not returned to the Avarian elders at all. The easterly and westerly kings had made it clear from the joint capital of Keth that the dominion was there to stay. An awkward peace ensued that infuriated the eastern Avarians, for the Druidic way of life in the west began to change. She stared accusingly at the gaping tunnel mouth, considering the crimes done to Avaria by both the Dominion and Ulumnor, and felt a strange anguish for that opening. As far as she was concerned, by rights, none of it should have happened, and that tunnel ought to have been solid rock, jutting from the long green grass. The cold air that whistled out of it seemed colder than the breeze that surrounded her, and even as an invasive thought urged her to step inside the impossible blackness for even a fleeting moment, the hairs on her back rose and surge of adrenaline curdled in her stomach. She would do no such thing. She turned from the cave quickly, a healthy sense of foreboding leading her away. For all she knew, a bear called it home now, or she would fall through a shaft in the black, or perhaps even there would be a particularly old and forgotten stranded Ulumnic raider within. None of it sounded particularly appealing. She loved an adventure, but she drew the line at putting herself under unnecessary danger, and she had a good instinct for it, or so she hoped. She washed her eyes across the small, shallow pool she'd walked barefooted in for a short time. It seemed like a good idea initially, but too soon it became too cold to cope with, and feeling rather foolish, she had been forced to retreat to the banks to dry her feet and struggle back to her knee-high travelling boots of finer quality. Another ruin remained near the pool. It was to be a former home and was likely a storage. It was too small to be a former home, and was likely a storage of sorts. But as with others, the flooring was completely gone. Only grass was on the ground, as was the roof of the structure, if ever there was one. But there it stood, as stubbornly as slate did. Its resilience to the wind definitely showed, cleverly coated one on top of the other in a simple yet proven formation, so far at least. Then her eyes fell to the lonesome tree beside the pool that she had rested beneath already that day. Facing the small pool was a boisterous jutting hill of earth, grass, and rock. At its short peak, crossed spears of some sort, embedded in the rock, lorded majestically over the quaint submitting pool. What their stories was, she did not know. She just wanted to keep staring around to commit each detail to memory. And then there were the scattered dots of sheep that simply stared at her, chewing their grass. She smiled at a nearby one. Its fellow bleated at her, whilst the other just continued to stare at her, unimpressed. The wind swept her black hair across her face as she began walking through the steady, rolling clouds about her, with a mountainous spine linked Hollow Pike, its northern sibling, Strandros. Linked Hollow Pike to its northern sibling, Strandros. Her legs were aching and her lungs were working hard, but still she continued her ascent until she reached the tip of the climbing ground that crossed mountains. And there, with barely a foot on Strandros proper, roughly halfway up to the vast spire of nature, the stunning Vesa Tarn slept in the distance. It was a vast oval lake, but held dominion over a large flatland on the mountain. A sizable landmass rested at its heart. The mainland clutched this island with a bridging stretch of land that ascended and descended once more, to reach the island where cherry trees reigned quietly swaying. Even through the clouds, the sun managed to lay upon the mildly disturbed surface of the tarn, urging a glittering display from its northern waters. So fiercely she wanted to swim in the lake when Eris had described it to her, and even then perhaps more so, so welcoming was its crystal clear water. Oh, but had the sun been stronger, she might have treated herself to a swim. Had the clouds not crowded her above, had the notions of slate within its waters slicing her feet not utterly put her off the idea, and worse, the thought of Kvallion stumbling across her bare flesh again, a rarely uttered and embarrassing anecdote for both from the days of yore. About Vesatarn's eastern side were fields of flowing stones and crags. Its west side, a glorious forest, stretched some distance and crawled up the slopes where the Strandos continued, reaching upwards. The trees were strangely small, she thought, or perhaps it was a deception of distance. To its western and south side before her were large open areas of grass and fields of red, white, and the Avarian green roses. She took another moment, taking in all the splendour of Vesatarn. The Sparrow Tops had afforded her so much beauty and peace and mystery in what little time she had spent there, and they were but 3 mountains of many. She had seen palaces, vast towns, arcane tricks, and beautifully sung lullabies. Those mountains rose above all that, and brought to her closer to herself than anything else had done in a long time, perhaps closer to herself than anything had ever done before. After some time taking it all in, she descended back down the spine and past the pool she had instantly fallen in love with. As stunning as Vesatarn was, gazing back to that smaller pool, she took note of a more intimate connection with the flare of nature. She came to thinking with every gasping breath as she passed the pool just how anyone could bring such evil into a realm as peaceful as that one. Right there, where she felt so much at peace, people came so full of greed and twisted malice. How could 2 humans be any more different? She could not get her head around it, and only tormented her more for not knowing. Yet also, she could only assume that in finding out such an answer, she would be equally tormented by what realization she would arrive at. One realization that did spring to mind, however, was that Kvallion had done her a service in suggesting the area. But then her belly grumbled once more, as it had done many times previously. The evening was growing short, and soon they would need to find shelter or return to Elder's Grove. It was time to head back to Eris and Kvallion, she decided, and to try to usher the men children back to the Druid enlyl. She smiled at the notion, but it quickly faded as she thought of Kvallion's plight. She'd given the pair enough time to talk. Eris and Kvallion were inseparable when together, and they had not seen each other for some years. But what tragedy had come to pass was trying at Kvallion as a ward and testing Eris as a friend. But it was a test neither would fail, Vanea knew. And despite all, she was welcome amongst the 2. She had just felt it more prudent to leave them to themselves for a time. It had at least given her time to explore the local splendours and twist her ankle, falling into one selfishly placed rabbit hole. After the ruins and slate huts, and eventually reaching a large full wall of rock on a sharp rise. I'm just going to read that again. After the ruins of slate huts, she eventually reached a large wall of rock on a sharp rise. In it, another sin, another alumnic tunnel. This one was much shorter, and she could easily see through to the other side. She had feared following Kvallion and Eris through earlier, and nothing had changed since then. Eris! She called feebly. There was no response. Eris! This time louder, but still half-heartedly. She contemplated calling once more, but then the idea she would be interrupting one heartfelt exchange or other played on her quite well. She decided to brave the passage. These tunnels are decades old, Vanea, she reminded herself. They're not suddenly going to collapse when you stick your ugly face under. If only she truly believed that herself. She took a deep breath and stooped lower, for it was but as high as her shoulder. Drooped forward with her head low, she carefully padded through. Strangely, the fear was nowhere to be felt when she was in there. Her short adventure through the mountain had empowered her to some extent. She could only smile uncontrollably at herself with this newfound courage as she ventured forth. That all dulled somewhat, though, when she then immediately stepped into some caches of rabbit droppings that were strategically left here and nowhere for her to fall victim to. Was it not enough for the wild beasts to pollute all the other sights she admired so much also? Somewhat offended, onward she went regardless, minding she did not bump her head on a callous, sharp rock above. As she neared the exit of a short tunnel, she found herself confronted with yet another staggering sight. Firstly, the tunnel gave away to a proud ledge blessed with lavender and flowers of white. Below her, an astonishing view to the valley below. Though most dwellings were below ground, there were permanently fixed tents of furs and large barrel-like structures for bathing that had some small fires burning below them, emitting thick steam for the heat. Barrel-like structures for bathing that had small fires burning below them, emitting thick steams for heat, and numerous herbs within them. Small wooden structures where one could store their personal effects were beside these, and amongst other surface-level structures were storehouses, a small number of watchtowers, and a brewery for their beloved mead. She could see the tree line of the road that had brought them all the way from Lursk in the Gailok Peninsula, and several distant waterfalls could just be made out in the sprawling green. She paused awkwardly, hunched as she was, and soaked in a grandly deep breath of content, and closed her eyes to the beauty before her and the caressing breath of the wind with its fragrant scent of bloom. An unexpected laugh from Eris pulled her away from that moment. She found Kvallion and Eris not far from here at all. Both were sat precariously with their legs dangling down from a deathly ledge that offered one a fall to their deaths at both sides. "Boys!" she cried, as though they were just that. Both men had been oblivious to her encroachment and turned to face with the alarmed woman. Kvallion smiled wryly at her, in his hand a small flask of wine. "Join us," he muttered, although, smile aside, he didn't appear as jovial as Eris. Eris was still shaking his head in amusement, trying to dismiss a source of laughter she had missed out on. Vinaya wasn't having it, though, far from it. "Get off the ledge!" she warned in a wild tone, still lurched over that she did not bump her head, walking awkwardly and, according to their shared grin, rather amusingly. "We should be going." "Wine is time, my love," Eris called, "and why waste either?" He took the flask from Kvallion in a manner that would seem amongst anyone else quite rude, but Kvallion didn't appear to mind. That is how the pair operated towards one another. Eris closed his eyes and knocked his head back. Kvallion laughed. Vinaya was confused. Eris turned to Kvallion and shook his head. With Kvallion's strange smile still fixed in place, he said, "Not happy wasting it on me, though, are you?" "Don't be a knob," Eris told him, tying the now empty flask back to his belt. "You're wasting time all the time you're not drinking wine, and I'm out. Let's be gone," he reiterated. Was that one of Matthew's old sayings? How do you tell? Come on, Kavals. You can't stay here all day and night. I can stay here until midday, apparently. Look, the car might have been a bastion of hope, defiance, and I don't know, trees and whatnot back in his day, but now he's just a pain in my arse if he's getting me to get into my mate. So, we'll go back, apologise, do a bit of scrubbing up. Don't know why, there's a cesspit under every bleeding tree. And then we'll get wankered at your old man's wake. What say you, mighty conjurer? That's what I said. Jealously suits you, Eris. Vinaya wasn't too pleased with what she was hearing. Eris, I think not. This Ekharne sounds like a good man. If it wasn't for him, Eris raced to cut her off. There wouldn't be a shit pit under every bleeding tree because the Druids should all be gone. Move on, love. Enough, Kvallion groaned. If we're heading back now, we'll have to make it a long walk. I'm not going to be back any sooner than he told me. He basically said dusk, earliest. Eris rolled his eyes. Fine. He crawled backwards to make space to stand on the ledge. Vinaya, initially relieved to see they were about to get off the ledge, saw that should Iris continue crawling backwards, he would fall from the other side. Iris, stop! She screamed. Iris turned on her and then followed her alarmed gaze behind him to the looming doom. She scoffed. Oh no, relax, woman. She felt it was very possible he didn't know at all. He then eased himself up and Vinaya sighed, shaking her head, only then coming out of a small tunnel. Kvallion offered her a relieved glare, but she did not miss. She wouldn't be moving from the spot now until she saw both from the ledge, and even took steps towards them, fearing both were too drunk to walk back across the stunning natural balcony. But Iris quickly held his hands down to Kvallion. Kvallion glanced up at him and then nodded ever so faintly. Both locked their hands around the river's wrist, and Iris hoisted Kvallion to his feet. Moments later, Vinaya was leading the vanguard as her trios were all stooped low, heading back through the tunnel to the mountain's grassy slopes, each walking like knuckle-dragging, hunched creatures. Iris marched behind Vinaya and grinned. Does it bother you, my love? He asked. Does what bother me? She panted back. Do these mountains have more curves than you? He laughed, slapping her rump. She paused and turned about to honour him with a baneful, quiet glare, simply shaking her head so as not to cause an argument with a lamenting Kvallion behind them. Only just, mind you. He blew her a kiss, but she simply turned about and carried on. She then heard a second slap, and Kvallion commenting, Bothers me that you have more than It bothers me that you have more than the mountains. Bothers me that you have more curves than the mountains. Don't be a man-shagger, Kvallion, Iris scorned, to the amusement of both men. Vinaya did smile somewhat. It was refreshing to hear some measure of mirth coming from Kvallion, but she knew his grief was far from over, especially when that mead and the wine had left the system, or should much more go in. It was night, and enlyl glowed with bonfires and soaring fire pits. Burning stakes impaled the ground like spears with burning blades, and the cool breeze sung to the drumming beats of revelry. The four elders sat before the willow hearth, a willow of divine nature and history. There were settlements and there were enlyls. Settlements with these trees that were planted by Wroth the First were the enlyls, and were settlements of pilgrimage for the Druids. The Druids often wandered the east and west, seeking these great holy icons. They were always at the centre of their communities, and beneath them an enlyl's four elders would often reside through all waking hours. These men were always chosen by the willow hearths themselves. For the most part, the elders discussed the affairs of their enlyl and, if applicable, issues facing other enlyls. The discussions were voiced publicly before the rest of the community as the people simply went about their lives. The willow hearths were the symbol of all things Druidic, and great parts to play in the unfolding of their lives for centuries. They were known less for their beauty, which was immense, more for their divine wisdom, which only the shamans, often called shapers, and elders could interpret. Opposite to the Druids, the Kefik did not view them as divine instruments, considering them simply as large willows of grand beauty and a commanding feature to otherwise rather bland settlements. Other trees throughout Elder's Grove were far larger and dominated throughout the enlyl, but it was the willow hearth that gave those larger trees their strength. Ortogor was observing the willow hearth when he caught the eyes of Elder Ekharne, who was smiling at him. The Arcanist merely smiled back and then glanced elsewhere, quickly and awkwardly. There was hardly an air of sadness about the evening, Ortogor thought, and perhaps grudgingly so. Outside the House of Weaving, the drums beat and the mead flowed, and the Druids danced around fires, singing their ancient songs that spanned back to the first days. Countless had joined hands and formed large rings that twirled in rotation around the outskirts of the Willow Hearth's mound. Above that elevation, the elders sat beneath it, discussing things and smoking their various herbs. There, above everyone, their faces still glowed for the light of the grand bonfires about the enlyl. Some revellers were naked, the men were painted in white woad, the women painted red. Others wore scant pelts and all cried out to the night sky. Ortego sat holding a bunch of green roses, feeling quite awkward both in the presence of such an occasion and in the absence of Auralyl and Kvallion. There was a certain vulnerability nudging at him. Although some approached to convey their condolences, granting him green roses, others seemed to slower their dances to cast him a dangerous glare. Given that Estage was sat beside him as Mondolm was neglecting his duty of ensuring Estage was eating, the idea had crossed Ortego's mind more than once that he should perhaps have a free of return to the House of Weaving. Each time he dismissed the idea as a silly reaction to innocent glares, another would come his way more intensely, more meaningfully, more dangerously. The idea would then revisit him. He also feared for Estage upon Kvallion's return. So shocked Estage must have been earlier, he was certain that Estage would be quaking in fear come the return of Harathon's favourite pupil, and Ortego might finally have to have that serious conversation with Kvallion about the man's behaviour and temper. He looked at Estage and Mondolm, who were both sat in silence. Estage was staring at the fires and dancers with a glint of wonder in his round brown eyes. Estage was easily distracted, Ortego observed, as was he himself, he had to admit. But Estage, so unseated and despairing earlier, was now so taken aback and mesmerized. Ortego was envious of that ability to simply watch and switch one's mind off. But he lent a distant smile to the world in gratitude of the fact that Estage could do so. Perhaps it was the child's ignorance of an ignorant world. Ortego had to ponder. Mondolm, on the other hand, his eyes were stuck on a pair of young topless women dancing in the firelight. A shameless tip of his tongue peeked out of the corner of his mouth, while a wide and encouraging smile was ready to urge them on the moment their eyes should meet. Ortego traced Mondolm's eyes to the young girls, and when he reached that source, his face twisted. Disgruntled with Mondolm's entertainment and the potential scandal that might follow, he leant forward and toward the 14-year-old, planting both elbows firmly on the table. "You're supposed to be feeding Estage, Mondolm," he said, cautious to instill the authority of age, but it was Estage who replied, "I don't want to eat." Not missing a beat, and without taking his eyes from the dancing girls, Mondolm simply reasserted this. "He's not hungry." Ortego blinked a few times. "That's not the point. I've asked you to feed him." "You feed him," came the deathly quick response that Ortego had come to despise of from Mondolm. Why could Ortego never be so quick himself, and instead had to trudge around his head of scattered and disconcerting thoughts? Ortego pressed. "I'm the senior student here, and so you're responsible for him then," Mondolm concluded with a very vocal hush. Ortego was now differing. He didn't mind ensuring Estage ate, but he was ever conscious that another victory for Mondolm was another step towards Mondolm never falling in line and pulling his weight like the rest. That is the wrong weight. With Auralyl hiding herself away within Harathon's chamber and Kvallion clearly a write-off for the evening, Ortego had taken it upon himself to look after the others and guide them through their terrible process. "I know you're hurting too, Mondolm," Ortego told him, trying a different approach. "We're going to get through this together, all of us." "The tits on these two, Ortego," came the sagely recommendation of the teen. Ortego shook his head in disgust at the youth, and then turned from him in objection. That said, his eyes inadvertently landed exactly on the same four objects of Mondolm's focus. Ortego himself couldn't seem to pry his eyes away from the young women for a few seconds, and that was only because it only took a few seconds for a catalogue of personal rules to be broken. Not least withstanding was because he was now in his mid-30s, and these appeared to be no older than 18. He couldn't argue ages of the younger folk anymore, which was even more reason for him to turn away to Estage's plate. "Come on, Stage," he told the lad, more than aware that the breasts were still dancing about in his peripheral vision. "Eat some cheese, and a bit of rabbit, all right? Or do you want the lamb stew?" Estage turned to Ortego. "No," the boy told him. Estage continued to stare at Ortego, who remained staring back, expecting some kind of further comment from Estage. There wasn't one. It was simply that. No. Ortego pouted. Estage turned back to the willow hearth, and then his face lit up. He turned back to Ortego. Will you ask Uncle Ekharne to take the willow earth again? Talk to the willow earth again. Ortego cocked his head. How so? What do you mean? Uncle Ekharne hugged the tree and whispered some things, and the tree shook, and then someone said that soon all the willow earths in Avaria will shake, and that way everyone in Avaria will know that Harrison died. Ortego frowned, disturbed by how easily Estridge could say such a thing. I think he only does it special times, Stidge, Ortego advised him, simulating a great sorrow on the young one's face. Estridge nodded in acceptance. Well, I only eat my dinner at special times. Ortego rolled his eyes and shook his head to himself. Then, Kvallion! Cried Estridge, pointing excitedly. Auralyl was once more within Harrowfen's quarters, where she had spent all day apart from attending Harrowfen's following to the Gravesmire. The room was shrouded in darkness. Even the closed and latched shutters of the window were in place, but the sounds of the ceaseless festivities from outside seeped in yet, particularly the dull, rapid, relentless drumming. She was sat in the faint glow of a single lantern. There were several in the room, but she had elected the subtle illumination of the smallest lantern. A thin coil of smoke from a burning incense of lavender drifted upward shortly before disappearing from the glow of the lantern and entering the black void that enveloped much of the room. She was perched on a chair in a long white shift, which reached to her ankles. One arm was folded on Harrowfen's desk, clutching a dirtied and discoloured wet handkerchief, whilst the other was upright, holding up her head in the palm of her hand. She sniffed and snivelled whilst lost in thought, trying to make sense of it all. How abruptly his death had been, and yet Ekharne himself had declared that other than Harrowfen's demise itself, there was apparently no sign of maliciousness. He was old. Everyone knew this, but he had never seemed to struggle with his age. She didn't even know exactly how old he was. Much of a man's earlier years were shrouded in mystery, and if there were any who knew of his younger days, it was not her. Try as she may to ask the old man herself. And so, with his age in mind, her thoughts kept coming back to that frightful argument between Harrowfen and Kvallion. After trying to stem the rage from both that night, Auralyl had no choice but to lead the others outside. The entire enlyl had heard every word and had rose out of their dwellings below the earth to observe the cottage and better hear the storm within. And so, as insane as it sounded, she kept having to wonder, was the loss of Kvallion to the arcane enclave too much for Harrowfen to bear? Was that argument perhaps the last straw that did him in? He was not one to have others worry about him, and so it was possible that any ailment he kept to himself. But such as those were often too difficult to hide, and it would of course also mean Ekharne had lied to her. How it gnawed at her, almost as badly as those drums. She surged forward and began thumping the shutter with the base of her clenched fist. "Shut up!" she wailed wildly. "Shut up!" Her violent howl, though, if one were to judge but by the Casaphone's unchanged tenacity, was not heard. She fell back into the chair and wept silently, shuddering with every memory of his final moments. She turned to the now made empty bed, shut her eyes tightly, and shook her head defiantly. There came a knock on the door. She cleared her throat and composed herself, if only to yell, "Go away!" over her shoulder, with a stoic and stern tone that the others were used to hearing from her, and yet the door creaked open. Once more she shut her eyes, this time in frustration. With a large breath, she spun about, pointing a menacing finger and looking as every bit as fierce as she looked exhausted. Her mouth gaping open, she prepared to unleash that same breath on a new wave of scouring words, but she was ultimately stayed. In the golden light of a hallway was a dark silhouette, and although she knew immediately that it was Kvallion, it took a few seconds for her eyes to be sure. Kvallion's face was as quizzical as hers, in contrast. His eyes were also adjusting to the dimness of the room. Auralyl was swift to turn away. She quickly began to upknot her hair, as if she would need to hide her face very soon, and needed her long hair to do just that. She couldn't have noticed a man ever so slightly waving from side to side. Elder Rodshard repaired the bookcase, she said, calmly, distantly from her own thoughts. Kvallion nodded slowly and awkwardly. I saw. You were not at his funeral, she muttered in disgust, her intent oozing off each word. Despite her now looking away, Kvallion still nodded in acceptance of that and stepped forward into the room, carefully closing the door behind him. You needn't come any closer, thank you. I can smell that meat from here. Iris had a couple of flasks, he said, confirming her strong suspicions. Went for a walk around the Sparrow Tops, my usual spot with a perch. Iris, she echoed, disgruntled. Yes, Iris. You tried to cheer me up. I had to pretend it worked. He thinks it is. I don't want to hear about Iris, she snapped, still fighting to loose the braids of her blonde hair. Or his talk. The sooner they're gone, the better. She could almost feel Kvallion smiling wryly behind her, but she was more interested in hearing him leave. But she heard nothing of the sort, just a tense, ensuing silence. What do you want, Kvallion? I don't want company, and I certainly don't want you to talk to me. Her words rolled with increased hostility. I certainly don't need to be listening about your Iris, and I don't want to hear about your day at the Sparrow Tops. Sorry, very, very tired. And then she leapt to a great anguish, twisting about in her chair, giving up on her braid. And the funeral! How could you miss it? It wasn't the funeral, Kvallion corrected. It was just the following. They think they're guiding the soul to the Gravesmire along with his body. The funeral will be in a few days. I know what a following is, she spat, turning away from him brashly. And Ekharne told me I couldn't go anyway, Kvallion reasoned, holding an arm out as if wielding some irrefutable piece of evidence. Well, by all accounts, you hardly put up a fight. He forbade it, Auralyl, and I couldn't argue because... And his words trailed off. He forbade it, Auralyl, and his words trailed off. And why is that? She snapped, twisting about to face him once more. This time, she even shifted the chair partly around several jumps, the chair screeching across the floor as she did. Come on, why? Why are you even still here? You didn't want to be here while Harrison was alive, so you certainly don't need to be here now he's gone. Her words came to a sudden, abrupt halt. Then she blanketed her lower face behind an open palm and raised her head high. I couldn't say anything, was all she mustered. Kvallion stood before her in a short moment of perplex. He was gazing at me, all through me. Couldn't tell. Suffering, Kvallion. I couldn't say anything. I tried. I just couldn't. And there the woman burst into tears. Her words were almost illegible, and were nigh a constant wail, like a grieving little girl who had lost her father. I couldn't hold him. I was too scared. I just watched him die before me. I froze. I didn't know what to do. Kvallion purposefully marched across the room and knelt before her as she wailed, and was quicker still to tie his arm around her, burying her face into her shoulder, whilst his own face shriveled up and tears began to fall. He said nothing, and wasn't even sure he was listening to her, such was the grief he too was now feeling. A keen dagger bled them both of tears in that dark room, in that darker still moment. You could see the lights. He said so I knew he was leaving. But I was too scared to touch him, or hold him, or whisper to him. Why didn't I do anything? He was slipping away. I couldn't shut his eyes. I couldn't touch his mouth. I tried, Kvallion, I tried. It's all right, Kvallion hummed pitifully like a kick dog. You didn't do anything wrong. He then lowered his head into her shoulder or so, as she sang Woe's song so loudly, with the songs of laughter and dance still trespassing into her lamentation. She clutched the loose clothing of Kvalion's back with a fiendishly tight grasp and pulled downwards. She could feel Kvalion's soft hands and arms wrapping around her head while rubbing his cheek against hers. She opened her reddened, weary eyes for but a moment and saw over Kvalion's shoulder the empty bed once more. Down came her eyelids once more, and she wept on. And there, in that dim sphere of light, the two unleashed their sorrows upon an uncaring room. Do I go for a quick cigarette? I've done a few of these today and my eyes are just gone. Yes, I will be back in a minute, which is exciting because I've seen live streams do this before. And somewhere there's a pause button or some shite like that. Fuck it, let's carry on. Fuck it. It's a lot of pomp for his old man, Iris said to Mondon with a tense fixed glare as if there was a follow-up. You'd think he killed a Draken during a Moon of Calamity. Well, he did, Ortogor pointed out, missing the implication. The Moon of Calamity was named after the Draken Moonor. Mondon threw his hands up dramatically. Well, he knows that, Ortogor. Can't you see the point? Keep staring at those girls, Ortogor, Iris grinned. And we'll all see the point. Ortogor smiled wildly, but his eyes showed little vested interest. Vinaya watched the exchange, scowling at the comments. She leapt in Ortogor's defence, though. Come on, enough. He knows it was a joke. News? Iris laughed. If I haven't taught you better kef than that, then I'll be sticking a noose around my neck. Mondon laughed horrendously loudly. An icy glare from Vinaya silenced his laughter to but a smile, which then de-escalated once more into the clearing of his throat and the readjustment of his posture. Iris leant back in the chair and began fidgeting with his ponytail. She had once admired how he could not resist playing with his hair whenever he had been both feet crossed on a table. But now Vinaya was growing tired of it, and she was still unaware fully of a druidic etiquette. Having one's feet on the table at the best of times was a subject of much ire in many places, but whatever manner of wake this party was, and amongst druids, she had no idea. She was bouncing Estage on her knee as the boy tucked into his cheese with the promise to eat the rabbit next. Estage had taken an instant liking to her to the point where it took some doing to pry Estage from her. The fair woman had seen fit, given the circumstances, to indulge its mischief. But if it was the friendly voice of Vinaya that had drawn Estage to her, then it was also true that the same soothing sound kept Ortogor fixated on her too. She was hardly aware of this, of course, mesmerized as she was with what was going on about her, although there was the matter of a small wonder on Ortogor's face also, for her part in finding such an easy time of getting Estage to eat. The almost envious gaze of Ortogor's was not missed by her. I won't ask you again, Iris. We are guests here. Show some respect. But Iris simply turned around with a cheeky grin. Why dance, my love? You then gazed back to the now mass of topless women and men of all ages. She gazed over at them glumly. You'd like that, wouldn't you? Only if you let me, he sniggered. He leant forward and tapped Mondon on the shoulder while he was sat with his chair turned back to Iris, facing the large convergence of smaller dancers. I bet you're hoping it's not your bedtime soon, he called. Mondon half turned to call back over his shoulder. I'm not going to bed until this couple are coming with me. Where have they gone now? He glanced about for the two previous young women he had been studying very closely earlier. Iris laughed. Might be in your bed. I wish, Mondon whistled, half turning about again. Orgo, grab me a wine. You're too young. Gah. Go on, Ortogor, Iris pressed. You all deserve a drink tonight. Grab him one. You can get one himself, Ortogor observed pointedly, having lost his will to command over Mondon in the presence of Iris. You can get me one yourself, Mondon answered, holding a wet bowl out blindly to Ortogor. Iris, smiling at Ortogor, nodded his head to the bottle of wine before Ortogor had winked at him. Ortogor shook his head. He can stop being lazy, thinking he can boss people about all the time. I don't boss people about all the time, Mondon replied. Just you silly goat. Silly goat? Eris smiled. Silly goat? He then laughed a short laugh and then stared at the bottle of wine. A second later, and it lifted into the air and drifted to the bowl Mondon was holding and began to pour its contents into the receptacle of its own accord. That's a good boy, came the patronizing response from Mondon upon feeling the bowl beginning to fill, believing it to be Ortogor's doing. Venea had seen enough. Eris, you know you shouldn't make weaves here. And only then did Mondon turn and notice the wine was floating. Most impressed, he called out in cheer, drawing the attention of several druids about. Venea leant forward and snatched the bottle and pulled it away into her custody before any more attention came their way. Don't be an idiot, she hissed quietly, aware there were now more eyes on the table. Suspicious, discontent, disapproving eyes. She shook her head at Ortogor, conveying her disappointment in Eris, but found him smiling at her rather than sympathizing with her. He simply shrugged. Another glance at Eris, and she found he, along with Mondon, was perhaps enjoying the dance too much for the wrong reasons. When will they take Estich to bed? She asked Ortogor. Ortogor opened his mouth. There was a slight delay, but then, as he put his lips together to speak, it was Estich that answered. I go when I want. Do you want to go now? She asked. He shook his head. No. Well, you're going to have to find your own chair, Estich, because your bum is killing my leg. She helped him down since he'd eaten all his food, where he sat on the ground beside Venea's chair. You can use another chair. You can use another chair, she offered, now feeling rather guilty for exiling him from her lap, seeing as he had chosen beside her her feet to lay her. I don't want another chair. I like the floor. I like listening and feeling the shakes. She stared at him, a little amused in her curiosity, but then she simply smiled at him in adoration. If the insects half eat you to death, don't tell Kvallion I am the one who let you sit on the floor. She then gazed up at Ortogor, who was staring at her again. A smile crossed his face as her eyes landed on him. Isn't the willow hearth wonderful? She asked him. He nodded excitedly, leant forward, and called back, Yeah! Have you been close to it? Another call. Nah! A momentary pause. Only the elders can go on the rise, much less arcanists. How does one become an elder? She then asked him, setting both elbows on the table and leaning towards him, putting all the attention she had into hearing the arcanist. He laughed quite loudly. You can't! You must be a man. She shook her head in confusion. Yes, but how do you become one? Ortogor shrugged back. It's strange, basically, to begin with, you get a green rose. No, right. So, somewhere, if there's only 3 elders with a willow hearth, or if a willow hearth has less than 4 elders, should I say, the tree goes a funny blue men druids, that is, find green roses and visit the trees. If the tree, willow hearth, feels the presence of someone it thinks is up to the task, it goes more bluer the closer they get. We're not talking a few feet away. I mean, miles and miles and miles away. Anyway, when you get to the tree, like willow hearth, you drop the green rose by the foot of the tree, and then it will shake if it approves. Then you're an elder. But like I say, you have to be a druid, I think, anyway. But I know, you must be a man, like me. Venea had been trying to follow, but her cheeks inflated upon hearing the like me. She was holding back a laugh, trying to gauge if he had said the words in jest, or if there was some strange subtext going on, or was a conversation simply a bane of his. Slowly, her inflated cheeks smoothened, and she managed to keep her lips sealed, although she could feel a smile coming along. Ortogor took a few sips from his bowl of mead, in haste, much of which dribbled down his chin and down along the front of his robes. Bye, he said, when he placed the bowl on the table. Venea was surprised. You're going? For now, he answered with a coy smile. He rose from his stool and turned about, walking straight into a large druid. Watch it, Arcanist, the man grumbled. I will, he laughed. I will watch it. Venea saw him then melt into the crowd of revellers. She then turned back to Mondon, who remained sat before Eris, the latter of whom was leant forward, resting his hands on the backrest of Mondon's chair he had brought out from his classroom. There, Iris kept yapping into his ear, drawing fierce laughs from the pair. Vinaya didn't think she needed to guess too hard about what they were joking about, still transfixed on a dancing Druid women, primarily the topless ones, of course. She turned to the beating drums and the flutes that were being played as children sang the Druidic songs. They were urged on by the steady beat of their parents clapping. It was a sight, and it was a wonderful sound. She smiled harmoniously as observed in utter contentment, finding solace in the children singing, sung with glee and without worry. Got no beat for this. Trust we must, in the dust of our lost souls, sing a song for those long gone, they have heard the calls. From the grand yonder, land of the lights, I long for the grand yonder, beyond my life. Vinaya's calmly face suddenly became distorted after that first verse. A song about death, sung by joyous children. It was strange to see children so young speaking so lightly of death and yet to be unapologetically unfazed by it. And then one woman approached one of these younger girls, only a year or two older than Estage, and leant down with a garland of holly and roses. Vinaya was somewhat pulled from her evening of intoxicating spectacle when the woman, presumably the girl's parent, pointed towards her. A moment later, the young child went skipping up towards the table. There she reached out and gave the garland to Vinaya. "Is this for me?" she asked, but the smiling child simply smiled shyly and nodded before skipping off before Vinaya could thank her. "Thank you," she called back, but the girl did not respond. She then turned to the mother and said the words again, silently and with the emphasized lip movement. The mother simply placed a hand on her chest and then held her palm out upwards. She then continued to partake in the revelry. So strange it was to the Malagornian woman that some Druids had only judgmental stares and even sneers and narrowed eyes of discontentment for them, and yet other Druids were taken aback by the Arcanist who lived there, and herself, and Iris. After all, to the suspicious culture, she was nothing more than a stranger from the West. What wondrous people! What wondrous people! She murmured to herself. The majesty of the willow hearth still captivated Vinaya as it stood tall upon its rise above all. As Vinaya gazed in further awe of the sight, her attention was soon brought to the four elders, all of whom were curiously bickering. She had not been at Elders Grove for long by any stretch of the imagination, and yet the sight seemed oddly disturbing to her. She would not be there long enough for their disagreements to have any lasting impact on her and Iris, thankfully, for she was eager to finalize their business and be gone, with or without Kvallion, given the tragic turn of events. That in mind, she gazed down to Estage, curled up in a fetal position, stroking the blades of grass where she sat. "Are you okay down there?" she asked. "Oh, good down here," he called objectively. "Oh, good down here." She gazed back at the elders. The most animated of them all was a short, ancient-looking man, stickly thin and bony, and yet seemingly furious, pointing accusingly at another elder, Rudyard. The bulking Ardvol behind him was nodding in agreement, and then a moment later, up popped Estage before her, holding out his hands close to her face. "Vinaya," he said at length. "Yes," she replied equally lengthily. "Are these berries or rabbit shit?" Kvallion had much to answer for, so it seemed, when it came to Estage's influences. "You have to be a man like me. You have to be a man like me," cursed Ortogor of himself as he stomped outside the circle of activities and drink and music. "What an idiot. You wonder why Mondon calls you a gout. It's because you're stupid, stupid idiot, stupid idiot." He stopped before one of the smaller trees by Elder's Grove near a small trickling stream, intent on making a small trickling stream all of his own. Down went his hand, and after some rummaging about, he raised his head and glared dead on at a cold, dark bark immediately before him. A moment later, he was urinating, feeling the warm air of his jet around his hands. "Like me," he said, again shaking his head. But then he had to smile. "What are you like?" A sudden snap of a branch above and just ahead of him stayed his word, and his passing water. He gazed up but could see a little amongst the wading shadows of branch and leaf. He tilted to one side and stuck his head out around the tree, gazing into the dark, but he could see nothing beyond what was immediately ahead of him. Trees, foliage, broken branches on the dilapidated small and brief wall just on the outskirts of the enlyl. The wind washed throughout the trees, swaying all in its vastly broad path. His eyes remained squinted as he glanced about. Looking back to Elder's Grove, he could hear only its ongoings, a myriad orange glows twinkling. He was not too far, but he felt uneasy. He gazed back ahead. Still nothing. Then footsteps behind him. He was quick to turn about to find Kvallion marching towards a tree of his own with a bottle of wine in hand. "Ought to go," came the simple enough greeting. Well, a good couple of seconds of urine had now been pouring onto Ortego's thigh in the horror of the moment as he quickly got a grip of himself and made to redirect his efforts. "Yeah," Ortego replied, somewhat shocked and relieved, wiping a soaked hand on the leggings. "What is it, lad?" He turned back to the tree and rolled his eyes. Lad. Ortego may have had a decade on Kvallion, but he was infinitely inepter, both in arcane matters and in what Ortego could only regard as the social arena. "Just a greeting. Stand down," Kvallion smirked behind. A moment later, Ortego could hear Kvallion gulping down the wine with a familiar trickling sound simultaneously, with splashing sound forming where the moisture was gathering on the ground. Ortego shook his head and rolled his eyes, now struggling to go himself, as was always the way in the presence of another. He thought of how to approach his condolences with Kvallion. He didn't want to say anything that sounded too cliché, of course, and yet in that moment, nothing else was really coming to mind. But it was Kvallion who asked, "How are you holding up?" Yet in that moment, "I'm sorry for your loss," came Ortego. Kvallion said nothing more. "How am I holding up? How are you holding up? Everything was basically like your father to you." "Thanks. It's as can be expected, though. But if you ever need to talk about it, Kvallion, please, you must talk to me about it. I insist." Ortego stared awkwardly at the tree. Still, Kvallion took some time in replying. "It's good. But I insist." "I know. You just said so." "It's a heavy burden, grief," he went on, "but you don't need to share it alone. Even if not me, It's all good, but thank you. And don't be thinking this is your fault." There was a pause. "I wasn't," Kvallion grumbled. Ortego smiled wryly to Kvallion, who had his back to him, gazing downward. "And don't worry about the school either right now. That's not your priority." Ortego turned back to the tree. He took from his belt a parchment he had written for Kvallion, knowing he would tumble and fumble before the man should he try speaking to him in conversation. "And what is my priority, Ortego?" Kvallion asked, in a tone that suggested he was growing impatient. You are. You must take care of you. The fate of the school is not your concern. Hereford's passing is a shock to you, and you know." Kvallion could be heard sighing. "No, I don't know, Ortego. Help me, no." Ortego could now hear a keen edge in Kvallion's voice. "Come on," Kvallion replied. "Enlighten me, Ortego, world-weary. Come on." "I didn't mean to upset you, Kvallion. If I have done..." "No, you didn't mean to, but you just talk and talk and talk. Read the fucking room, man. I have spent the whole bloody day trying to put his death behind me already, if but for one day, because apparently these druid tossers don't give a fuck, and I'm expected to show up to this farcical revel. I don't need you, a clueless waster, long past his prime, giving me any advice on anything. How about you sort yourself out and then worry about me, eh? How's that?" "I'm sorry, all right. Just don't want you tinkering, different between Hereford's death and the fate of the school that's probably now in your hands. I mean, there's a lot for you to worry about," but somewhat disparaging over how the conversation had gone, he took the parchment back into his belt. Ortego turned again and quickly withdrew his manhood into the confines of his hose, and only then dared turn and look Kvallion in the eye. The man was a far cry from comforted with his words. And yet the fool talks on. Just do us all a fucking favour, Ortego, and fuck off. Do you ever think about what you're saying? Take off that silly Magus' hat that you seem to think you're wearing all the time and learn that you're in no fucking position to tell anybody how to behave on anything more than bloody child's play. Look, Kvallion, he pled. I'm sorry, I was out of line. I didn't think. Do you ever? Fuck off, Ortego. Kvallion turned to leave, but then paused a moment and spun about to face Ortego once more. Here, have an all-seeing fucking evening. He threw the bottle at Ortego, who reached out, and despite both arms are flailing, the bottle hit one of his fingers, bending it back hard and falling down to the dirt and the earth. Kvallion stormed off. I'm sorry, Kvallion, he called back, woundedly, but Kvallion showed no signs of even hearing him. I'm sorry, he muttered again. Ortego scrunched his shaggy hair up in both hands and then threw his arms out to his side. Stupid tosser, he growled and grumbled at himself. He gave Kvallion some time to get ahead of him before daring to return. He kicked the bottle with his first stride, so soon forgetting it was there, and so swooped down to pick it up. It was almost a full bottle of wine. His heart was heavy. No matter what he did, where he went, or what he said, Ortego's best intentions were always met. His gift of gaining the enmity of any he crossed paths with, regardless of the terms. Feeling grim, his eyes turned to the bottle. He shook the bottle. There was still a good amount left. I mentioned this already. Sorry. Just going to repeat this bit, sorry. He kicked the bottle with his first stride, so soon forgetting it was there, and so swooped down to pick it up. His heart was heavy, no matter what he did, where he went, or what he said. Ortego's best intentions were always met with the gift of gaining the enmity of any he crossed paths with, regardless of the terms. Feeling grim, his eyes turned to the bottle. He shook the bottle. He shook it. There was still a good amount left, despite losing some to the earth. He took a sniff and recoiled with a ghastly, twisted face, then pouted and gazed back and forth between the bottle and Elder's Grove. He wasn't entirely sure he'd want to go back there just yet, until Kvallion had cooled off, and more importantly, until he himself felt so much as a modicum of self-respect. He felt the mood plummet within himself as his heart had grown heavy. Stupid, idiot, fucking goat, he growled wildly, clutching his fists and gnashing his teeth. He took the rolled parchment he bore on his belt, and tailing as many thoughts on Kvallion and himself, then cast it to the ground. All around him dark. He cursed himself for much of the journey. If he had just left his notions of all-knowingness aside for but one moment, perhaps he'd still have the face to remain at the revel of Harathan's wake. The music, the drink, the warmth of fires, and clearly more than all, the warmer still delight that was Vinea. She had been enchanted by the lot of it, and Ortego had every chance of teaching her so much about the Druidic culture she was apparently gorging into. He'd heard her speak about their journey up to the Sparrow Tops, to what was known amongst the students as Kvallion's Perch, and how she had witnessed the great Vase Tarn. She hadn't seen any of his favourite spots yet, and there was no mention thus far about how long they would be staying. He feared it would be only a matter of days. And then there was the constant images of Eris smiling at him knowingly, for Arcanus knew he was taken with her, and that so hapless was Ortego that Eris didn't even have to do anything about it but laugh at his futility. But in Ortego's eyes, Eris himself was a disrespectful, lecherous drunkard, and it angered him that he was as much. She deserved better, he decided. The angered and besotted man continued drinking his wine, following the path that would lead him to Elder Grove's burial grounds, the Gravesmire. For his frustrations with Vinea, his self-loathing for his treatment of Kvallion, and his drunkenness for the 2 mazes of mead and half a bottle of wine that was a work in progress, Ortego was something of a mess. He hadn't even noticed that his twilight excursion this deep into the woods would ordinarily trouble him no end. I could be a lecherous, disrespectful little shit too, he grumbled. But I won't. I'll just fucking die alone and unaware that my dick can wither away before I end up like Eris and his ilk. He tripped on an exposed tree root, stubbing his toe, bending a nail, and almost losing his balance completely. He growled at himself and recovered. As a long veil of cloud revealed the perfectly rounded, bright moon, some light lent to him, only minor, and it did little for his nerves. He was all too aware that the closer he encroached through the disturbing woods and drew closer to the gravesmire, the more the growing number of feathered ones would gather. His eyes flashed to each caw of a crow to find it glaring down at him from the branches above. The howls of far-flung wolves seemed to slowly meld together in greater numbers as if rallying to meet his excursion. Even crickets seemed to grow louder the further he went. And where the shadows grew, his darting eyes seemed to pick up every movement from the corners of his visions. A creature raising up a tree immediately beside him, glistening moonlight upon the slimy stone of a rock before him, a bush waving in the wind and cackling sporadically as something far quicker than his eyes dashed from it for refuge elsewhere. But for it all, his nerves and paranoia were then no match for the anguish he suffered for himself and the alcohol he had continued to imbibe. The moon was hidden beneath the dark clouds yet again, and his heart began to bid him return to Elder's Grove. But he wouldn't. He deserved this moment of exile. He wouldn't drink alone out there with one person who he would drink alone out there with the one person who would listen to his every word and would not judge him. But even as he thought about that, a terrible fluttering from the ground beside him took him by surprise, more so than the others, drawing a gasping shriek from the flailing arcanist. He staggered back and crashed to the ground on his backside. A black feather landed in his lap, which he could not immediately identify. He groaned wildly a moment as he kept swiping at it, thinking some large centipede had just dropped upon him from above before he saw it for what it was. He bemoaned himself yet again, then climbed to his feet, drank some more wine, and continued forth. He didn't need to do so for long before a foul stench reached his nostrils, and the peculiar whistles of the ward chimes that kept the ravenous beasts at bay could be heard. The corridor of trees soon gave way to the clearing, and there before him was the Elder's Grove gravesmire. Where earlier it was crowded under a blue sky, it was now everything it wasn't then. Empty, dark, foreboding, and utterly sinister. The rancid smell of the thick bog at its heart was somehow worse at night. In such scant light and heavy shadow he could not see over plimps that made a circle around the swamp, plimps upon which the resting druids of the recently deceased slept, and nor did he want to. He wanted to see only Hierophants, but what was perhaps more eerie than that circle of death about the putrid swamp was how all of those squabbling creatures, however near or far, had fallen immediately silent upon his arrival, down to the last cricket, that only the sound of a brash cypherism could be heard. I can't even remember what cypherism is. Stillness, silence, a stench, and death all assaulted him as he entered that circle. Hierophant was laid upon a stone table, ever so slightly illuminated by the moonlight above the boggy clearing, and there Ortogor's deceased Magister waited to be sunk into the swamp. He looked down from that grim fort and to Hierophant, and frowned, then sipped some wine, then frowned again. His Magister, his teacher of arcane, lay bare on a bed of green roses, with red and white ones burying his lower torso and below. His head was lifted ever so slightly, cushioned beneath simple woven grass. The wind had been kind, or perhaps it was Ekharne's shamanic earthen tricks, or the shaper's talents at work, but flowers and all seemed to have remained perfectly intact. Around his head, a wreath of flowers children had made, and what a job they had done, Ortogor thought. Upon his face, one subtle, final, proud, resting smile. Uncomfortably enough for the Kef was how Hierophant's eyes remained open, so that he would be settled by both gentle blue skies and the tranquil nightly stars. Ortogor would maybe need to warn Kvallion about the open eyes. The arcanist was amazed the disturbing wind chimes in the trees had kept the creatures at bay, for they had rung relentlessly, despite as little as light breezes, and had survived dutifully among stronger winds. For all the reasons he had conjured against the idea of leaving the dead in these awful places, he could not see one such reason in that moment. It was peaceful, unspoilt, and calmly final. Ortogor's cold brown eyes closed over for a moment of deliberation. I will only do my best because I can do no more, he muttered sadly. something Harrison would curse when his common sense was missed in arguments with those who were bored reason for an outcome that immediately befitted them. He took in a deep breath and leant forward ever so slightly to kiss the brow of his Majesty, but he did not do so. Fear took him. He recovered. Ortogor leant forward and kissed Harrison's brow for all half a second, and then gave him a final smile, trying not to pay attention to how icy cold and hard that forehead had become. "It is cold here," he said. "So you don't go anywhere. I'm gonna try to light a branch." He began walking here and there, gazing strangely at the soft, murky ground he had stalked upon. Ortogor was a dreadful arcanist. His limited ego limited his confidence, and his dire memory made it difficult for him to picture arcane runes that unleashed arcane weaves. The arcanists often preached that if one could pull off one weave of magic, the rest would become easier. But now, in the dark, in a night that promised only to get blacker as dark clouds continued to gather about the moon, and the cold air settled in, he would talk to his Majesty in warmth with wine. And it was but a simple weave, one so simple, in fact, that it was typically one of the first arcanists were trained to weave. One of the first weaves arcanists were trained to weave. One of the first. I don't want to write spells. To master. It had crushed him so that he could not do it, but if ever there was a time, there's no one about to think you a fool, he encouraged himself. Fire time. Still, somehow Ortogor did not find a branch as quickly as he would have liked. How hard can it be for you to find a bloody branch in a bloody forest? He cursed to himself in frustration. As he fumbled about one murky spot to another, the thought had crossed his mind to break one off the branches, but he had to consider if that was legal by Druidic customs. This was hallowed ground, of course. Once again, he became too aware of the crows and the owls gazing down upon him, though silent they remained, almost judgingly. It was unknown to him why owls and ravens did not fear the chimes as did all other beasts, but they didn't, and nor did they disturb the dead. His growing impatience was now superseded by anxiety when "Stick!" he called out victoriously, stooping low to snatch one off the ground. It was slimy and moist, but it would do the job. He held the branch out high in front of him and raised his other hand before it. He had seen Kvallion set a light to things with little more than a thought, but Kvallion was special. He had a gift. Conjurers, some called him. He hardly had to imagine the runes to unleash their powers, whereas Ortogor, Harrison, and every other arcanist he personally knew required an arduous process of concentration and reimagining. He closed his eyes and pictured the demon's rune for fire in his mind. He tried to imagine it as clearly as he could. Thoughts rushed to him, though, and he became conscious he was trying to picture nothing but that rune, and even when this line of thinking was enough to annul his efforts. He growled out unintelligently. I'm going to read that bit again. Sorry. He tried to imagine it as clearly as he could. Thoughts rushed him, though, and he became conscious he was trying to picture nothing but that rune, and even this line of thinking was enough to annul his efforts. He growled out something unintelligibly before kicking a stone into the darkness. Calming himself, Ortogor swung the stick around in several arcs before returning to his stance and took a deep breath, slowly breathing out as Harrison had oft told him. His eyes closed again, and the arcanist pictured the rune in his head once more. Even in his head it began to glow ever so slightly beyond the control of his imagination, as if this mental image became an entity of its own within a space in his mind. He felt an obscure heat beginning to rise within him, and yet it felt no less natural than a stiff breeze around him. His arms grew warm. He tensed greatly to control the channeling of power that was awaking in his limb. With the glowing ember of that picture now beginning to burn behind his tightly shut eyes, in his mind's eye, a breath of fire blazed out of his hand in a brief but great gust of flame. The glow of it lit up the Gravesmire. The heat of it quickly singed his face. He shrieked and fell back. He had done it, and impressively so. He may have been much older than the typical arcanist of his novice level, but Ortogor Razlan had weaved his first weave. He had conjured fire, and an incredible dosage of it at that. He looked at the stick beside him now, so engulfed in flame that he had to quickly gather himself and stomp out enough fire that it would not completely disintegrate his firebrand. Rising to his feet, feeling like he had redeemed himself of 100 blunders, his smile wide and heart singing, pride lit up his face almost as much as the flash of fire that had so briefly threatened to immolate him. And he had achieved it in a place which would generate boundless ire amongst the Druids. That detail had been quite forgotten for his intoxication of the drink, but it was time to present his success to Haraphan. How all those negative feelings and fixations had so quickly been released from him in that one moment of personal profound glory that only he had witnessed. It was a beautiful twist at the end of an otherwise ugly day. Ortogor Razlan quickly got to his feet when he heard the damp thud behind him. He froze first. His heart pulsed violently. He slowly turned about, terrified but by what manner of beast he might find, and found a most upsetting sight. Haraphan's plinth upheld none. The Magister had been pulled from it, perhaps by a beast of the forest or a spy of the night. He took one slow footstep after the other and circled around the stone plinth until he saw that Haraphan was now face down on the ground. He gazed his eyes elsewhere, seeking the culprit, trying to already reimagine that ruin in his mind. "Show yourself, menace!" he yelled at whoever had shifted Haraphan's remains. His voice was still a far cry from threatening, but he felt bolstered at that moment that he had managed to weave flame. Even so, seconds after this call, his own adrenaline, racing heart, and a deathly silence unhinged his brief-lived confidence. The putrid swamp defiled his mouth with each pant. He could taste his own fear. "How dare you!" he cried out. Haraphan's body remained limp, face down in the muddied earth, naked roses scattered about his fall. Ortogor rotated about on his feet, scanning the blackness of the short, fell horizon. With a flaming branch in his hand, giving the Gravesmire a small, bright glow, the night only seemed darker yet. "That is Haraphan Mellifane, and you will defile his corpse no more!" The fear in his voice could not easily be masked. Then, silently, there was movement, and to his horror, it came from none other than Haraphan himself. The old tutor motioned. Ortogor sporadically choked in shock. He froze. It made for far more frightening sight than any beast he could dream up. It stole his breath and his heart's beat. The stick was now burning so close to his hand, and yet he did not even register the scalding sensation. But the horror before him did not cease, and only unfolded further. Haraphan planted one elbow firmly on the ground, then the other. "Magister! Magister!" Ortogor quaked. Haraphan raised a little further still, planting down one knee in the boggy ground, then the other, before he rose before him, lolling his head around up to face his horrified audience. His eyes still stared towards the stars, whilst the Magister's body squarely faced Ortogor, and the children's garlands remained whilst misaligned on his crown. A few roses remained settled upon him as he stood as still as death itself. "Haraphan!" the terrified and awestruck Arcanist breathed out again. Ortogor was hoping against hope there would be some form of humane response yet, but there wasn't to be one. Haraphan fumbled closer, making graceless thuds in the ground with each step. Ortogor could not be sure of what he was seeing, and the fear in him held off any real chance of any sane thought. That the master was not dead at all was the student's sanest path of logic, but the bleak eyes were as lifeless then as they were moments ago. It was all wrong. A malign darkness was at work. Finally, his panic took a new turn. No longer would it freeze him in place, but the very opposite. His fear peaked, and it became his time to flee. Both of his feet were locked where they were, however. More treachery, his reactive thoughts assumed, but looking down, Ortogor found they had simply sunken into the mud. Haraphan staggered towards him. Sorry about some of the rereads then. Getting a hang of this reading. Obviously, 40. I feel like I am my speed is volatile. I feel like when it gets more exciting, I get more excited, and I'll read a bit faster. I don't mind that so much as long as it's understood. People still understand me. But I feel like sometimes just normal pace speed, reading speed seems to go. I feel like I'm reading slow and I don't think I am. So sometimes I'll hurry it along and then I'm reading super quick and I don't realize, and I start choking on words. And it is purely by design, some stupid style of mine, that sometimes I just throw in fucking tongue twisters anyway. Not good, not good. Es ist nicht gut. Es ist schlecht. Sehr, sehr schlecht, mein dude. I might do one more. Chapter 3. We are actually on page 38 of 475, just for a bit of context. I did warn, it was a big one. So I'm going to leave that there, and I'll be back very soon. Chapter 3 coming up. And I'm still looking up here. I think what doesn't help is the fact my eyes are always up here anyway, and I'm constantly drawn to here. So when I do want to talk to the camera, oh no, got down there. Anyway, bye bye.